Okay, so let me go ahead and officially welcome you to our sensory session looking at managing microbes during non-inoculated fermentations. Before we really jump in today, I'd really love to know kind of where you guys are coming from. So we'll go ahead and use that raise your hand feature that I just talked about. And I'd like you to raise your hand if you have ever done ambient non-inoculated fermentation on a white wine. So if you've ever done a non-inoculated fermentation on a white wine, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, so we've got a couple more coming in. Okay, so we've got some expertise out there. Okay, so go ahead and if you've got your hand raised, go ahead and lower your hand. And then now go ahead and raise your hand again if you've ever done a non-inoculated fermentation on a red wine. We've got examples of both of those today, and they are a little bit different when we're trying to manage them. So, okay, some more folks out there. All right, you can go ahead and lower your hands again. So I guess I'm curious, for those of you that did raise your hand, you know, when we think about doing non-inoculated fermentations, there's a fair amount of risk that goes along with that. So if you are one of those people that raised your hand there, if you would be willing, we would love to hear what it is about the non-inoculated fermentation that makes you want to take the risk to do that. So why not just add commercial yeast? What do you get out of that non-inoculated fermentation?
Want me to start?
You can go ahead and start. Sure, Matthieu.
Except if somebody wants to go first, but I'm going to be talking a lot. So. I don't know. I mean, there's something about personally on my natural wine journey is to try to get a bit more natural, and so in this journey, I think trying to work with natural yeast fermentation it's a natural step. Also, there's something to be said that wine's been made for centuries and centuries, and we didn't have selected yeast in the past, so it should be working with natural yeast. So that's a bit the idea behind it. And then a lot of things can be discussed about like the validity of having what is really natural yeast, and I air quote natural yeast. But you know, when you try to talk about terroir and site and everything like that, you know, it's if you've got something that works well without help of commercial yeast, why using commercial yeast? So that's where I'm going, and that's my thought process behind it.
Great.
I think one of the propellants for that interest in Virginia is in the 90s, we had Dave Ramey come out and present some wines, and he was really kind of the North American guru for this term now that we use, this microbial terroir. And at the time, of course, all the academics were saying that you'll spoil the wine. There was a big thrust to suggest that that was really a tangential practice. But he brought some wine, had been doing this at Chalk Hill, and brought some wines out, and we tasted them, and they were considerably different, and for the most part different. They were fuller, they were rounder, they had deeper palates, in some cases because they had a little bit of residual RS. But I think that was an interesting propellant for us in Virginia, to a few people to put their big toe in the pool, so to speak.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. So yeah, I do feel like there's that idea of the fuller, rounder mouthfeel to it. And Lee adds that sometimes we can get some more complexity because we have some more complexity in what's going on there. So as we sort of think through today about our ambient fermentations, I think we've already brought up kind of a couple of things there in terms of how do we encourage that diversity, that roundness, that sense of terroir, but discourage any of the spoilage characteristics that might be coming along with that, or things that might be taking away from the specialness of those wines. And I think that's a great place to start today. So let me go ahead, I'm going to share my screen. Play and move forward. Okay, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and have Matthieu. We'll start with Matthieu's experiment. So that was flight number 1. So Matthieu, this was an experiment that was really part 2 of an experiment that you did last year, looking at some issues, some issues of non-inoculated fermentations in Sauvignon Blanc. So Sauvignon Blanc was new for you at King Family last year. And so I think I'll go through a couple of details of what happened in last year's experiment. But before we start, tell us just a little bit about your winemaking goals for your Sauvignon Blanc. When you're thinking, I'm going to make Sauvignon Blanc, what kind of style are you trying to accomplish with that?
I mean, my thought is, even if I like drinking them, I didn't want to do a New Zealand style Sauvignon Blanc. So I didn't want to do a technological Sauvignon Blanc. So I didn't try to protect my juice from oxygen or for anything like that. And that's in the same idea. It was making sense for me to work with natural fermentation, because the idea was to try to do something with as less as possible as to be used on this wine. So.
Great. So, and I think that's an important point to remember as we go through the results from last year and also evaluate the wines this year, is that, you know, Matthieu's not really looking to have the most grapefruit, sweet citrus, boxwood kind of Sauvignon Blanc, but rather a more French-driven style for that. So we just need to keep that in mind. So,
more austere, I will say.
Okay, a little austere. Elegant? I don't know. We can choose. So if you, I'm going to kind of breeze through a couple of the results that we found from Matthieu's experiment from last year. This one was a virtual experiment or a virtual sensory session. So if you missed that one last year and you want more details on that, the whole recording for it is posted on YouTube as well. So again, last year, basically Matthieu did an experiment where he whole cluster pressed his grapes. He kept a relatively low SO2 environment. So he had a little bit of SO2 in there, but not very much. Not a lot of other protections against oxygen. So not gassing it with CO2 or using dry ice or any of those things that people do.
I do gas it. I do put CO2 on top of the tank, but I don't heavily put dry ice on the pan or anything like that. I'm doing my normal, low profile.
Yeah. So generally protective, but not like hyper reductive. So that juice got settled and went into barrels for fermentation. And last year, Matthieu used 3 different yeast groups for fermentation. He used X5, which is a pretty thiol-driven yeast, so one that's really meant to give you a lot of that Sauvignon Blanc flavor profile. He used Diana, which was one that still is recommended for Sauvignon Blanc, but is also talks about minerality and some of those other characteristics. And then his ambient starter culture. And again, that's one where he takes the grapes in the vineyard, squeezes them into a bucket, allows them to start fermentation in the vineyard, then strains out what's going on there once that fermentation has started, and uses that to inoculate his barrels. What we found last year was really much like what we would expect in terms of the fermentation curves here. So the purple curve represents the Diana fermentation curve. The blue curves represent 3 different barrels of X5, and the green curves represent 3 different barrels of the ambient starter culture. And as we can see, we have much more robust fermentations in the inoculated fermentations, and a little bit more sluggish fermentation in that ambient. And if we look kind of down to the dates at the bottom here, we can see that the inoculated ones took about 3 weeks of time, whereas the non-inoculated ones, or the starter culture, took about 5 weeks of time. So we did really have quite a long, drawn out period of time there. When we looked at the chemistry of the wines that resulted from that, and I'm just showing you X5 and the ambient here, we can see that the X5 finished fermentation and finished its aging with most of its malic acid intact. And did have lower volatile acidities. Our ambient one, basically most of the malic acid had been consumed by the time we took these numbers, and we did have higher volatile acidity there. So that was one of the things that we'll talk about how to address that in this year's experiment. Another notable thing here, when we did our sensory analysis of that, by and large, the X5 did have significantly higher descriptive numbers for most of the things we think about with that New Zealand style Sauvignon Blanc, so citrus and boxwood and tropical fruit. But it also was rated as being more complex. So sometimes when we think about that complexity with our ambient fermentation, complexity can mean a lot of different things. And in this case, that inoculated fermentation was very fruity, expressive, whereas the other ones weren't. But we wanted to sort of think back to that idea that we saw here with, with the ambient ferment still having so much influence of that malic acid degradation, so that malolactic fermentation. So we sort of wanted to look at it and say, could we do an ambient fermentation that maybe doesn't have that malolactic conversion and get a little bit more Sauvignon Blanc profile without getting that New Zealand style Sauvignon Blanc profile. So that sort of led to the approach that Matthieu wanted to take this year. And that was just trying to prevent malolactic fermentation in that ambient fermented Sauvignon Blanc. So yeah, Matthieu doesn't really want to just add more SO2 to his fermentations. As you can tell, he wants to do things as naturally as possible. And he also tends to try to dial back on the SO2 when he can. So another idea was the use of Ketosand. So if you're not familiar with Ketosand is an organic compound. It basically comes from it comes from a process that starts with chitin. Chitin is found in the cell walls of fungi and in the exoskeletons of crustaceans. It's a pretty simple industrial process after that to get to Ketosand. It has been used at all kinds of different times in winemaking. What it really does is it binds to the cell walls of some microorganisms. It does help to sediment those so that you can rack off of them, but it's also been shown to disrupt their cell membranes, cause leakage and ATP loss and some cell death as well. So we thought that we may be able to use Ketosand during the fermentation to knock back some of the population of malolactic bacteria to see if we could get a cleaner fermentation and to knock back that possibility of malolactic. So that led to this year's experiment. So Matthieu, do you want to tell us how you set things up this year, which yeasts you used and who got Ketosand and when?
Yeah, so last year I didn't like the Diana, the results on the Diana. Not only it was a very fast fermenter, but I didn't like the flavor profile of it. And so I didn't reuse the Diana. There's an artist got a yeast called Q9, and that was interesting enough. One of the descriptor, and I don't read too much, the way they sell things, but yeah, the descriptor says they increase the wine minerality. So I did find that interesting enough to do 1 barrel of it just to try it. Anyway, that's a side note. I wanted to keep using the X5 because I think the X5 last year did show some very interesting results. Maybe not the direction that I really wanted to go, but I did find the blend of my natural ferment and the X5 last year working very, very well in the wine profile. So I did keep using the X5. And the main, and of course, my natural yeast fermentation. The main part for me was trying to prevent the malolactic fermentation by using the Ketosand at the same time, more or less at the same time during the fermentation. I did at the same time.
So in this case, we do have 3 different yeast treatments, I guess. We have the X5, the Q9, and the Vineyard starter culture. And for both the X5 and the Vineyard starter culture, there was a Ketosand addition after fermentation began. So again, with that idea of trying to prevent the malolactic fermentation at that point. So to give you an idea of what you have in your flight, when it came time to decide which comparisons to make for sensory, the X5 actually had some reduced notes to it this year that we thought were kind of getting in the way of the sensory profiling, which we'll talk about when we look at some of the chemistry. So what you have in front of you is really a comparison of the Vineyard starter culture and the Vineyard starter culture that had been treated with Ketosand. So if you're in group 1, wines 476 and 107 were just the Vineyard starter culture, and wine 921 is the starter culture plus Ketosand. If you're in group 2, wine 788 is the starter culture only, and wines 595 and 311 had the starter culture plus the Ketosand. If you're in group 3, Wine 625 was the starter culture only, and 526 and 907 are starter culture plus Ketosand. And if you're in group 4, wine 686 and 471 were starter culture only, and 448 was the starter culture plus the Ketosand. And then we did include that fourth bottle of the demonstration, and that was just the Q9 yeast in case you wanted to do a comparison of an inoculated fermentation along the way. So we'll sort of go quickly through some of the chemistry that we see, but of course, most important are the sensory. So before I show you the fermentation curves from this year, I wanted to just review, remember last year, we had kind of a 3-week fermentation on our 2 inoculated ones and a 5-week fermentation on our non-inoculated or our vineyard starter culture one. This year, when we look at the different curves, the blue lines represent the X5, the yellow line represents the Q9, the green lines give you the vineyard starter culture only, and the purple lines give you the vineyard starter culture plus the Ketosand. So what we can see is that, once again, we have a faster fermentation with our inoculated versus our vineyard starter culture. But there's an important difference here. If we look at the timestamp on the bottom, we can see that our inoculated ones actually fermented within about a week's time this year instead of taking 3 weeks. And our vineyard starter culture was finished in just a couple of weeks. It didn't take that same 5-week period of time. So in this case, we don't really have that same sort of benchmark, or we don't have that same sort of fingerprint of a sluggish fermentation in the starter culture. This year, that starter culture seemed to really have a fairly robust fermentation, whether we added Ketosand or not. The other thing to notice, the Ketosand was added on the 18th, so you can see where those curves were at that time. If you've done ambient fermentations before and you've started to see those curves kind of slow down, it's usually right about at that inflection point that it starts to slow down, and that's where we think that our malic acid bacteria might be causing some competition. So that's a good time to add it right there. And also by that point, the barrel's kind of self-mixing. And so you can think that your Ketosand is going to have a fairly good, a good mix at that time.
I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I've added the Ketosand exactly at the same time on all the batch. I was trying to target for the first third of the fermentation at the end of the first third.
I can check back on your operations. It may be that I'll check back on the thing that you sent me because you keep all that on the computer. So I
don't think it's that important. You don't have to check for it, but in my head, I think on the selected yeast, I've added it a little bit earlier. Okay. And then on the natural yeast fermentation a little bit later, just because they weren't exactly at the same stage. But it was 1 day more or less, so it wasn't a big deal. But yeah.
Okay. So when we look at the finished chemistry, what?
No, it's not what I've done. This is what I was trying to do.
So when we look at the finished chemistry here, we can see that, again, unlike last year where we had some elevated volatile acidity in the starter culture, this year both the starter culture and the starter culture plus Ketosand treatments ended with pretty good volatile acidity. So in this case, I basically took chemistries in December as well as in April. And if I took chemistries from multiple barrels, I'm reporting them to you on this chart. So I realize it's a little bit of a busy chart, but in this case, in December, we see this is pretty much fairly soon after the finish of fermentation. We can see that we didn't really have much malic acid depletion or lactic acid buildup in our vineyard starter culture. And in April, we started to see a little bit of conversion there, but not very much. Certainly not what we saw last year. Where we had the Ketosand added, again, we didn't see much malic acid depletion during fermentation. And really during aging, we started to get a little bit of movement there as well. So sometimes we think Ketosand completely makes that not possible. That's not necessarily the case. Matthieu is aging these with really low SO2 in the environment. So we can see some evidence that there is some lactic acid or some malic acid depletion. I will say that the ones that you're tasting come from the barrels that are shown in bold here. So these were barrels that were from the same cooper, the same year, and had been undergone the same use. But we did end up then having the vineyard starter culture was one that had a little bit more malic acid depletion than than the one with the starter culture plus Ketosand. So we do see a little bit of difference in the chemistries there. Just in case you're curious what happened with the inoculated ones, the Q9 basically, again, finished with volatile acidity, not that different from our ambient starter cultures. And again, the malic acid profile there, it wasn't really going through much mallow. What we see that's very different from what we see for the X5. So the X5 started a little bit of malic movement even fairly early on in December. And by the time we took those numbers in April, we had seen a lot of malic acid depletion there, a lot of malolactic fermentation. And that was true whether there was Ketosand in those barrels or not. In Matthieu, when I think back to sort of, the reduction that they were showing there, that might be part of it, is we maybe have been tasting them sort of, very soon after they had finished their malolactic fermentation. They probably still had some of that funk left in there. So again, that idea that Ketosand prevents malic acid depletion, that's not always the case, or at least it isn't here in a low sulfur environment when you're aging on lees. So at this point, we'd like to sort of talk a little bit about your sensory impressions. If you need a little refresher on who's who in your glasses there, you can take a look. But at this point, I'll maybe stop sharing my screen and we can go ahead and have a little conversation. So first of all, maybe let's go back to that raising your hand. Raise your hand if you were able to tell the difference between the wines. Were you able to tell the difference between the wines? Again, reactions, raise your hand. Let's see what we get. If you're raising your hand, sort of keep it up just a minute so that I can, and you can do that. Yeah, it's okay if you're just raising it on your video either way. Okay, it looks like we've got a pretty good amount there. So I'll obviously run the statistics there, but it does look like it's a significant number. So for those of you that were able to tell the difference, what difference could you tell in the wines? What was different between those two for you?
I thought there was some brighter acidity in the starter with the Ketosand versus just the starter only.
Okay.
There's a little more weight on the palate with the starter only for us. Okay.
And those would be things that at least would be consistent with the idea of having a little bit more malolactic going on there. Other things that help determine the difference.
I had the same idea of, a little bit more tropical fruit on the starter only without the Ketosand. And probably because it did bring maybe a little bit more, what's a yogurty component that make it looks like a bit more tropical.
Okay.
So anyway, I was surprised to get it right because I did find it fairly, I did find a difference, but I wasn't, I did find them still fairly similar in style.
Okay. Okay.
I agreed with both of those. And I think the one with the starter only was more like riper tropical fruit, like moving toward like guava or very ripe peach, whereas the others had more brighter fruit and acidity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. So Carl is saying that he feels like the starter was creamier, and perhaps that again was from the malolactic, and I would agree with that. Tom says the starter had more tropical notes with the banana. And I think that banana was, I would agree. I saw the banana in there. And then Sharon, there were more aromatics and palate weight in the Ketosand, and it had a brighter finish. So again, going back to that effect. What about the Q9? What did you think in comparison to the Q9? Let's see, if you've got your hand raised, go ahead and lower your hand and we'll ask another question with the Q9. So maybe which did you prefer, the ambient fermentation or the Q9? Did anybody prefer the Q9 over the ambient fermentation? Let me ask a yes or no question. If you preferred the Q9, raise your hand. Okay. Looks like Craig liked the Q9.
I'm reminded of the work from David Mills' lab that really kind of springboarded this more modern discussion of microbial terroir, where he looked at inoculated wines at different wineries using the same yeast, but at different wineries, and found out that the native yeast at those wineries within the wineries were frequently more involved in the fermentation than the actual inoculum. So when you think about Q9, keep in mind that that Q9 is a function of the environment of Matthieu's vineyard and may not be the same as Matthieu's winery, may not be the same as yours.
Yeah, and also like we had, it was 2 years ago now on the VWA meeting where what I've got finishing the fermentations probably D254 anyway. So, you know, based on the strength of this yeast, you know, I've got no, you know, I'm not delusional about exactly which yeast are working, but I do like, I mean, I don't think I want everything like the Q9, but I did find it fairly interesting. And again, if we talked about, I think like last year X5 worked fairly well for me, even if it wasn't the style that I was looking for. This year it didn't work out at all. I mean, that's also to mention is same yeast, same protocol, same old. Last year worked very well, and this year didn't. So so I will blame it on my cellar assistant, but because you know I cannot be responsible about everything.
Whatever works.
He's on
for you,
this
huh?
call, you know. He's on the call.
That's a big oops.
Right. I think you both make a good point, though, that, you know, we're treating this as if the vineyard starter culture only fermented with that and wasn't affected by the commercial yeasts that are already in the cellar. And we know that that's not usually true, but also the idea that if we inoculate with something that's the only thing working, and the literature says that that's not necessarily true either. But we do see that they did have very different sort of fermentation profiles in terms of kinetics. And so I think it's an interesting question to kind of keep thinking about that. You know, is this about the pace of that fermentation? Is that about what the microbial community is doing during that fermentation? So Matthieu, let me just ask you, you know, you're going to make Sauv Blanc again this year. What are you thinking?
I mean, I'm going to keep going with my natural yeast fermentation. I'm going to still playing with the Q9 because it was the first time that I'm using it. And I still think there's a bit of flinty components. I still think there's a bit of nutty component that also slightly different than what I'm getting used to, and I think as a blending tool that could be interesting. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be using the X5. I'm probably going to do a barrel or two of it just to confirm or not if it works well or not. But I'm also, last year I was a little bit upset with my natural fermentation because I ended up having a VA that was a little bit too high for my liking. Again, this year, whether I've used the Ketosand or not, I had almost the same result. I mean, same result VA-wise, at least. But I'm almost positive that if I would have used the Ketosand last year, I would probably not have the VA that I ended up having last year. So I think I'm going to keep using the Ketosand in my protocol because it's I mean, it's a tool that I've been working with Ketosand for over 10 years now, maybe not, yeah, probably almost over 10 years now. And I start feeling very, very comfortable about how to use it and when to use it. And even if it affects a little bit the flavor profile, I think the change is more due to malolactic fermentation or no malolactic fermentation more than anything else. So yeah, that's probably the way I'm going to be going.
So Michael Henney has a question or comment?
Matthieu, what's your thinking on your timing of the Ketosand ad for next year? And that this year, when you added it to your ambient inoculation, you know, ML did not go through whether you added it or not. And in your where you added the yeast, and that didn't prevent it where you added it versus not. Do you have any thoughts on adding it, say in December or January or some other point?
So the thought of adding it before at the beginning of the fermentation is try to prevent the malolactic fermentation to happen at the same time of the alcoholic fermentation and resulting of the higher VA. On my sparkling based one that I've done this year, I did add it post fermentation just to make the wine safer. That didn't work either. it didn't protect me. I mean, not with the low level that I'm adding. So if you really want to prevent malolactic fermentation, you either need to go for higher level of sulfur, or you need to use lysozyme would be probably more efficient to prevent the malolactic fermentation than Ketosand. But again, for me, it's if there's a bit of malolactic fermentation, so be it. It's like I'm not overly worried about it, especially with the styles that I'm doing with this kind of like barrel fermented Sauvignon Blanc. I feel like it can take a little bit of malolactic fermentation without changing too much the profile that I'm targeting.
Right. Well, we want to make sure to get enough time here to look at our second flight. So let's go ahead and shift into that second flight. And then if we have time at the end, we can come back with additional questions or comments for Matthieu as well. So at this point, I'm going to welcome Todd. Let me see if I can get him spotlighted. It's my new, there we go. All right. And there we go. So Todd, why don't you and I sort of started to talk about ambient fermentations in your red wines a couple of years ago. And you've been doing these at Lost Creek since, I think you told me 2016. So tell us a little bit about what your reasoning, why it is that you want to be doing your fermentations with ambient yeast, and also kind of what your approach is to getting that done.
Yeah, I mean, we started, like I said, we actually kind of started sort of getting interested in native fermentations back in probably 2014. And it was more just kind of an interest level. And we were talking to some people and like this, I'm kind of interested in this concept. And, you'd get this reaction of, bug eyes and like, are you crazy? And there's too much risk. And yet the theoretical addition of complexity by having just a diverse population of yeast species contributing to the ferment was pretty compelling to us. And so we kind of just kept kind of poking at it and coming back at it and started working with a guy who was very familiar with native ferments and been doing it for 10 years. And I think it kind of developed a protocol that he was comfortable with, and we started adopting that.
So I've got some pictures, but tell us what your protocol is.
Sure. So first of all, it's I mean, above and beyond anything else, it has to be super clean fruit. We won't even attempt to do native ferments on fruit that's not absolutely clean. So that's necessary. And then temperature control is the next thing. So we will bring the fruit in, we'll chill it overnight. So we actually process on the sorting table cold fruit down to about 34, 35 degrees. We do everything in T-bins at Lost Creek. And then we'll do a 2-day cold soak. So we protect it with CO2 blanket and cover it with saran wrap, so it's completely protected from oxygen. And then we bring it out of the reefer truck after 2 days, and then we just allow it to slowly come up. It's really, I think, kind of theoretically the good yeast species will sort of wake up out of their cold coma a little faster than the bad microbes, as long as you've got clean fruit and good temperature control. And so you'll slowly start to see the ferment build up, and within a few days, if we're doing in parallel inoculated T-bin and a native T-bin, we might find that the native T-bin might be behind by a couple of days. And then its overall process is just a little bit slower. So in 2016, was our first attempt at it. We had an extra ton of fruit. We did a side-by-side comparison of inoculated versus uninoculated, and we pressed them separately, we aged them separately, and we just really liked the results. There was more complexity to the wine, more interest, better finish. And so in 2017, we did about 40% native fermentations. 40%, meaning about 40%.
Did you say what SO2 level you had, Todd? I didn't hear.
Yeah, we would at crush, we added 50 ppm in 16. We added 40 ppm in 2017.
It was 40, and it was 40 this year too.
It's 40 this year too, yeah. And so in 2018, we were so, I think, kind of happy with the results in 2017, we told ourselves that we were going to try to go 100% if we could in 18, and then 18 was 18, so we did 0%. And I think back in 19 and 20, I think we were back to about the 40%. So, you know, it's nice to have it as a blending component and a little bit of risk management. We do see elevated VAs when we do this. You know, I think on average this year we came out of at pressing our native ferments were about 0.1 to 0.14 VA higher than the inoculated, but for us, they're well within our comfort zone, and just the complexity of the wine I think is worth the risk.
So we'll have an opportunity to taste a couple of those comparisons in just a minute. The experiment that Todd did several experiments with this year, but the one that you're tasting is really just a comparison of the non-inoculated one versus an inoculant with D254. We also have data from an inoculation with BDX. Sorry, I can't see that piece of it. Before we jump into the specifics of that too, I just want to take a couple of minutes and think about what that microbial community is probably doing during that time when the grapes are coming in and when we're in cold soak. The more and more molecular techniques are giving us a lot more information on who's actually on those grapes and kind of what they're doing as we go along. So I thought it might be useful to think about that as we're evaluating the data that we're about to show. So when we think about the grapes themselves, there's more than 93 species of yeast and 50 species of bacteria that have been isolated from the outside of grapes. And so these things are by no means sterile when they're coming in. And the more studies are done, the more numbers of species are added to either of those lists. But as Todd said, it's super important to have clean grapes, meaning intact grapes, because as long as the grapes are intact, it's really a terrible place for microbes to live. They've got a waxy cuticle, there's no moisture, there's nothing to eat. There's very few microbes that can actually live on those grapes. So what they do is they clump around the stomates. So much like we think about stomates with leaves, these openings that allow for gas exchange and water exchange on the grapes after veraison, they have stomates too, and they're kind of stuck open. So they leak little bits of juice onto the outside of the grapes. And so when they find communities, the microbial communities on the outside of grapes, they're really clumped at these stomates. That doesn't really give you too much to work with until something happens to change the outside of the grape. So if there's some opportunity for a wound or for microfissures, then suddenly there's this starter culture and there's a lot of nutrients and you get a really big bloom of the microbes that are around. So suddenly you've got a lot of more nutrients around, and those microbes can go from maybe like 1,000 per millimeter squared to like 1,000,000 per millimeter squared really quickly. So basically that's what's happening if you've got any wounds in the vineyard and your grapes aren't clean, but it's also what's happening as soon as you pop those grapes open at the destemmer, you also kind of have this starter community that's there ready to bloom. The other thing to remember is that Saccharomyces really is very rare on the outside of grapes. It's like 0.05 to 0.1% of the microbial community might be Saccharomyces. But as soon as there's good juice around, Saccharomyces does a really good job of competing for that. So they quickly become a much larger member of that population. So when we think about, just to give you an idea of what that looks like, this is a sample that was taken from sound grapes. They found 6 species of non-Saccharomyces yeast, but on sour rotted grapes, they found 23 different species. So again, thinking about, what kind of microbial community do you want to be trying to manage? Do you want to manage one with, a reasonable amount of diversity, or one that can be bringing in any amount of genetics along with them? So I think that goes back to that idea.
Some of this recent work is a little scary in that if you look at the climate models, they say we're going to start getting a lot wetter. That's kind of off-putting for us, because Todd mentioned 2018. That brings back some flashbacks to some of the in the audience here that I'm sure is rather unpleasant. Yeah. But very interesting study didn't just came out, but came out from WSU. They looked at 2 vineyards in Washington State, and they found that within Washington, and they compared what they found in Washington State with around the world, they found 16 unique yeasts, kind of highlighting your previous slide there, Joy, showing the wide proliferation of yeast. It's interesting, when we did some work in the 90s looking at different yeasts in one of our vineyards versus California, and we found a quantitative difference, but not a qualitative difference. But with the more advanced technologies now, there's much greater range of yeast. But I think with the climate getting wetter, we liable to see some changes. And I think not only those changes will come from rainfall, but we did a study in California looking at Syrah, where you could grow Syrah in a tight canopy versus an open canopy. It's not going to affect the anthocyanins too much, but it wildly affected the yeast population. So that's another thing to consider. There's going to be some changes from year to year, and that's those are the climate and the solar interception on the fruit are going to be important for this dynamic of what you actually have on those grapes.
Yeah. And I think I would agree, and what I've seen in the literature too is that basically we tend to have kind of a similar group of the usual suspects on the grapes, and I've listed some of them here, but the particular portions of who's there and who's not there does seem to go along with what the climate is looking like and what the environment is looking like. One on this list that I do want to highlight here is Clochra apiculata, is also called Hansenaspora. This is one that tends to be very prevalent. And we'll come back to that one in a couple of minutes as we look at some data. But this is the one that really gives you a lot of ethyl acetate, which is sort of the nail polish remover effect that we can sometimes get when, especially if we have wet grapes coming in. But anytime we sort of have this slow buildup of fermentation, because they're not really inactivated very much by cold soak. They tend to proliferate during cold soak while everybody else goes to sleep.
They're not inactivated by SO2 easily either.
Exactly. So you need to have SO2 levels more than 50 and even free in order to even get them to do anything. So just keeping that in mind, but you can see some of those usual suspects in what they're doing. But then we have to remember though, that as we've been saying, they're not all bad, but some of them are potential spoilers like we just saw. But some of them do have some known good qualities as well. So some of our indigenous flora can really have some proteolytic enzymes that our Saccharomyces don't necessarily have, that help to break down some of those cells on the skins of the grapes to give us more nutrition and to release flavor precursors. And some of them give some of their flavors of their own, like glycerol and succinic acid, and some things that do enhance some of our varietal character. So again, we're kind of dealing with that balance point of saying, how do we get that diversity to be doing the good things and prevent the bad things? But then the other thing to remember is what happens as soon as we start fermentation. So again, we've come in, we've got this big population of Hansenaspora and other guys that have proliferated during our cold soak. But as soon as we start that fermentation, there's lots of things that strongly select for our Saccharomyces. All these different things, basically, Saccharomyces is very good at competing in an environment that has high osmotic pressure and high ethanol levels and low pHs. And a lot of our other organisms don't do as well in that environment. Yet lots of our winemaking choices kind of will elongate that earlier period when we've got lots more diversity there, or make that a lot shorter. And so we'll kind of keep that in mind as we look through some of the different things that Todd tried with his ambient ferments. So again, getting back to this, what we ended up tasting today is the non-inoculated and the D254, so that you know what's in front of you. If you're in group 1, if you wine 722 is D254, wine 562 is D254, and wine 117 was non-inoculated. If you're in group 2, wine 265 was D254, wine 708 and 867 was not inoculated. If you're in group 3, wine 513 and 197 were D254, and wine 957 was non-inoculated. If you're in group 4, wine 266 was D254, wines 487 and 809 were non-inoculated. And then we had this demo. So the demo was actually not the third yeast group. Instead, the demo was sort of a medium between our non-inoculated and our inoculated, in the idea that it's essentially inoculated with one of those non-Saccharomyces yeasts that are thought to give us some complexity. So this one uses BioDiva, which is a selected strain of Torulaspora. And then a couple of days later, it's inoculated with D254. So Todd, do you want to talk just a second about the BioDiva, why you're using it, and how, when you would use that as opposed to using your inoculated or your non-inoculated?
Yeah, well, so this is the first year we tried it. So Jackie came on board as a harvest intern last year, and I think to call her a harvest intern is a little bit of a disservice, because she's got a tremendous amount of experience with wineries from around the world, and different sizes and different regions. And so she kind of introduced this to us from what they were doing in Priorat in Spain. And it was interesting to me because, yes, we would like to have native ferments because we like the result better, but there's just some times where, quite frankly, you can't do it and you don't want to take that risk. And if you go down that path where you're going to be maybe a little bit more conventional, a little bit less risk taking, is there something else that you can do to maybe engineer or maybe buy back some of that complexity? And so doing an initial inoculation with a non-sac yeast, and then coming back 3 or 4 days later and inoculating with our sac yeast gives us a little bit extra complexity in the wine. At least that's kind of what we were wanting to test this year. And I think we'll test it more in the coming years. But it's just a way of maybe trying to buy back that complexity when we make the choice not to go native.
Great. So we'll look at a little bit of data here, and then we'll get to our sensory. I realize we're running a little bit long, but Lost Creek is one of these places that runs a lot of data. So if you look and I'm going to skim over some of this data right now in the interest of time, but you also have these in your in the chat box if you want to look at the PDF files for this. The most important thing for our experiment is to see that the chemical environment that most of these started with were roughly the same. So we have pretty much the same Brix and pH and TA throughout all 4 of our T-bins here. I did want to point out, I think this gives us an interesting view into what's happening before cold soak and after a cold soak with regard to pH and potassium. Sometimes we talk about when should we be taking our sample and what is that sample really telling us. If you're not doing a cold soak and you're just taking the sample as soon as you destem, basically you're getting what's happening when you're first cracking open those grapes, but there is a lot going on in those grape skins that hasn't really had enough time to happen there. So we can see that we do have a pretty big increase in pH and potassium just from kind of giving a little more time on skins. In this case, we also see an increase in yan, but I will say that in this case, we saw an increase in yan. In other ones, we did not see that same increase in yan. And that was part of a conversation that we had during our nutrient seminar as well. So when is the right time to take the numbers for yan? And I would say if you are doing a cold soak, definitely take your chemistry numbers after the cold soak is done. But if you're not doing a cold soak, you still need to take those numbers before you actually inoculate, because your inoculation is going to change things so much. But it's good, I think, sometimes to just see how those numbers would shift if you gave it a little bit more time. We were able to take some microbiology or some microbial counts on these. I will say that we need to take these a little bit, we need to realize how we took the sample in order to know how to interpret them. So basically, Todd took this juice sample, spun it down in a centrifuge, and then removed the liquid from the solid part and sent those 2 tubes to ETS overnight. And then they reconstituted them and took the number with the idea that that would hopefully keep the effects of fermentation from affecting the numbers too much. But we do need to realize that that's not a perfect way to take that sample. It's just the best way that we have available to us, because we don't currently have a way on the East Coast to take these kinds of numbers. I think what we can see here is, first of all, we don't have a big difference between the 3. We wouldn't expect there to be. We haven't done anything different yet. But we can also see that our Saccharomyces is starting about 2 orders of magnitude lower than our acetic acid bacteria. And I think that probably tells us something about the competitive environment that our microbes are in as we're coming out of that cold soak. When we look at the fermentation curves here, we can see our inoculated bins definitely did start fermentation as soon as they were inoculated. They were ready to go. Whereas the one that had our non-inoculated bin, after it came out of cold soak on the 15th, it still took 3 or 4, or I guess 4 days or so to get started. And so again, thinking about that microbial population of what it's doing during those 4 days, once it actually gets started, it has a nice, strong, robust fermentation. It just has more time in that kind of getting ready and getting started stage. When we look at the finished wine chemistry, this is the finished wine chemistry at the very end. So I think we took this, maybe 3 weeks ago. So after everything was said and done, most of the chemistry is the same, which we would expect. We did see some elevated levels of volatile acidity in the non-inoculated one, but we also see, not that much different in our D254. Again, because Lost Creek is really good at taking a lot of data, we're actually able to look at volatile acidity numbers at multiple different time points during the course of this wine. So we can kind of say, if we are worried about this volatile acidity number in the non-inoc, when do we see that actually occurring? And here I think we can see that, at the end of fermentation here, the non-inoculated one did have considerably higher volatile acidity than the others. And that then we had essentially the same amount of gain after fermentation before and after malic. So there was just the higher number there was something that certainly was happening during that time between the end of cold soak and after fermentation. And that makes sense if we do think that we have a higher population of those non-Saccharomyces yeast that might be giving us complexity, but also have the potential to give us some volatile acidity. The other thing I'd point out here is the ethyl acetate number, which is over here on the very right-hand side of the bottom table. Ethyl acetate, again, is that compound that gives us the nail polish remover, varnish kind of sensory effect. When you read the ETS logs on this, they basically say that the sensory threshold for detection of ethyl acetate is between 90 and 150, depending on the wine. Below that number, it can lend complexity, and above that number, you start to perceive it as a flaw. And so what we can see is in our 3 inoculated ones, those are well below that 90-degree number. Our non-inoc is right in that range where it could be complexity or it could be perceptible. And so that's another thing to think about, is that, it might be giving a little bit of complexity, but it's also, you're getting a little bit close to the edge on that one. Now, Todd did have a couple of other comparisons that he did. We aren't going to taste those with sensory, but I did want to show you a couple of numbers that came out of that, and then we'll talk about your sensory impressions here. We did talk a little bit about ways to sort of diminish the potential for volatile acidity in ethyl acetate. We came up with kind of 2 approaches. One would be to kind of try to rob it of oxygen at the beginning. So those organisms that might be spoilage organisms during cold soak, if we rob them of oxygen as much as possible, they have less possibility of making volatile acidity. So the standard procedure at Lost Creek is to use a carbon dioxide gas. Others are using dry ice. So Todd thought that he would try his hand at that and see if it helped with bringing down the VAs at all. And then in another experiment, we tried to sort of address a little bit that microbial population that might come out. So again, the 2-day cold soak being the standard there, he did one that had no cold soak and one that had a cold soak that was treated with Ketosand. So when we look at I'm going to skip over the preliminary numbers, just trust me that they were pretty much the same fruit when they came in. When we look at the CO2 versus dry ice, we don't really see big differences here. Let me see if I can move this so that you guys are not blocking there we go. We don't see big differences between the CO2 and the dry ice in terms of the microbial population that we're looking at. So it doesn't really.
Did you calculate that this was the same volume of gas after subliminization?
No, I mean, it's really very impractical to do it. So I think the idea was, what would we practically be able to do with the CO2, and what would be the practical idea with the dry ice? So in that case, it's not a comparable amount of CO2, but rather it's just one protocol versus the other protocol. And again, in this case, it didn't really seem to make much of a difference in our microbial counts. Oops, I lost it. And again, our volatile acidity actually ended up to be higher in the dry ice than in the CO2. And Todd, you said that was just sort of impractical for you to be able to use dry ice on any amount of scale. Is that right?
Well, maybe, I guess. I think we had the the misfortune of trying to do this experiment right in the middle of COVID, and dry ice production is a byproduct of gasoline production. So with nobody driving, there was like this shortage of dry ice right around the time that we wanted it. So we got our hands on a little bit of it, and we paid an exorbitant price for it, which really wouldn't make it practical for us. I mean, it was just as easy. We probably spent about $70 in dry ice versus about 70 cents in gas for the two treatments. Some of that may be elevated by the COVID effects that was happening last fall, but for us, there was really no reason for us to be interested in trying this again.
Yeah, and I feel like there are places that are using a lot of dry ice, but it does sort of take getting it all set up to have the dry ice chest and to have the delivery set up and everything else. So the other approach there
was sparging with dry ice.
Pardon?
I would suggest you consider sparging with dry ice, with carbon dioxide. Sparging the must. All you have to do is dissolve a little bit in there, and it would slowly come out a solution. Might provide you the ambient anaerobic atmosphere you're looking for.
Yeah. So there's another, we can try that one next year.
Yeah.
So the other idea was to think about what might be happening during that cold soak in terms of our microbial population. And here what we see, again, these numbers were taken sort of after cold soak when things got into the cellar. And we can see, again, that in this case, we do see a big difference or an order of magnitude difference in the hand Xeniospora that we have, whether there's a cold soak or not cold soak. So we've got 10 to the 6 cells per milliliter, I guess, in the no cold soak. We have 10 to the 7 cells per milliliter in the cold soak. So we might want to just think, and again, Xeniospora can be doing good things. It can be giving us some proteolytic activity, but it can also be that thing that's producing ethyl acetate and acetic acid. So just realizing that cold soak is doing what we think it's doing. It's just a matter of whether that's something that you want to be happening or not. And again, when we look at the, when we look at the finished volatile acidities, though, that didn't really seem to help in the end. We did have pretty comparably, in this case, kind of high volatile acidities at the end of that. So it wasn't the cold soak. The lack of cold soak didn't really solve that problem in the longer term. So, so at this point, though, I'd like to kind of stop sharing and if you're willing to put your screens on again, I'd like to get back to our comparison here and see what you think of the different wines. And so again, if you're willing, if you want to raise your hand, if you were able to tell the difference between the wines. Are you able to tell the difference between the wines? Looks like we're about evenly split there, a little bit more. So we'll have to do the statistics on that one. So people who were able to tell the difference, what was it that made the difference for you? Were you, what differentiated one from the other? You have your hands up. I could call on you if you want. Got a couple of things here. Okay, so Amanda was able to detect the ethyl acetate, and Lee was able to detect some of that VA difference. So that was apparent there. Matthieu felt like the natural yeast one was more complex. So he saw the complexity side of that. And then Michael Henney also was able to sort of tell the difference in the volatile acidities there. Okay. Others, anybody else? I mean, I was able to tell the difference, and I sort of saw both sides of that. I felt like the non-inoculated one, I thought it had sort of more roundness on the palate, but I was able to detect the difference in volatility. Now I had also seen the numbers, and so I'm not really a very good example there. We also felt like the inoculated one was spicier, so it had a little bit more spice component to it. And Sharon says she enjoyed both wines, but they were very different. So the natural yeast was bright and fruity, while the D254 was more dark and brooding. And I do think D254 as a yeast itself does tend to give us that like dark brooding character to it. So we're probably seeing the yeast come through at a little bit there too. How about the ethyl acetate? Let's see, if you have your hand raised right now, if you could lower your hand so we can ask the next question. We can get there. There we go. So I'm curious if you were able to tell the difference, or if you were able to perceive the ethyl acetate on the non-inoculated ones. And it's okay if you go back right now and taste that again or smell that. Are you able to perceive it now that you know it's there? Or is it something that you're like, that's below threshold? Because remember, we were sort of right in that space where it could go either way. So if you were able to perceive it, go ahead and raise your hand. Amanda, you're not alone. I could too. Oh, okay. We've got a couple more coming in. Okay. So really, it seems like that's kind of a split decision there, right? So some people might be a little bit more sensitive to it, and some people might be less sensitive to it. So again, getting back to that idea that it may be lending complexity, or it might be giving us some of the some spoilage as well. So, and Michael Henney says it's it's below threshold. Sorry, so it's below threshold for him. So in that case, you're not having to worry about it so much. Okay, BJ, you still have your hand up? I don't know if you want to talk or if you just have your hand up. Oh, he put his hand up.
My hand up on accident. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem at all. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't ignoring your comments. So, okay, what about the BioDiva? What do you guys think about the BioDiva? Do you feel like it lends? And to be fair, there were a couple of other differences in the winemaking here. It's not a direct comparison. But did anyone prefer the BioDiva to the other two? Okay, Beth, you want to tell us what you liked about it?
Sure, I'll just unmute myself. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I just found that it was a little like richer and rounder than the other ones. I thought it had a little bit more aromatic and kind of darker fruit character. So just my opinion there. I thought it was cool to try.
Yeah, I agree. I felt like there was some more, I like the darker, it sort of had a little bit darker fruit to me as well. And I did like that. So, okay. Any other comments about the differences that you see here, or questions for Todd about his particular approach?
How about the nutrients? I didn't recall hearing about what was the nutrient regime, Todd, that you used? I assume you added some nutrients.
Well, with native, it's not such a mob scene in the ferment. So we'll allow for much lower yans than maybe we would normally.
Yeah, that could be offset
if I can hit 90 to 100 yan, then we won't add any nutrients at all.
Okay.
I don't, you didn't have any, you keep really great records, and the records I saw did not have any record of nutrient additions. And so I don't think that you're adding any nutrients. And Matthieu, you can chime in here too. I don't think you were adding any nutrients either, were you?
Well, in the past, that's been a concern because some people have gone a little bit too much on the SO2, which can deplete some of the nutrients, particularly thiamine.
Yeah, that's a good point.
With that Devo, one advantage with that Torulaspora, that's actually a better antioxidant group than SO2 is. That yeast is a great bioprotector. So you could really, that's another good reason to consider that. If indeed the climate models prove to be correct and we end up having wet years and bringing in fruit that may not be pristine, using something like Torulaspora and even Meshnikova might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, there's a number of different non-Saccharomyces yeasts that are commercially available at this point, and they're marketed for different things. So there are ones that are marketed specifically for bioprotection, and then there are some that are marketed specifically for complexity. But as Bruce said, sometimes they do both. So Matthieu, you tried to pipe in there. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, not just about the nutrient. I did not add any nutrient in my trail that will go a bit against using natural yeast in the process. I wanted to say something about, I've done an experimentation, not really an experimentation, but this year I had some red fruit that did come fairly compromised, I will say. And because I didn't care much about it, I still decided to go for a natural yeast fermentation. And I was very, very happy about the use of Ketosand at crush. So fairly heavy rate of Ketosand at crush, and inoculated right away with a yeast starter that was fully going, make my fermentation start fairly quickly. But I ended up having some level of volatile acidity, very, very, very low. So for me, that did really help me into my approach about natural yeast, because I really feel now I can work with grapes that are not. In the past, I really thought that my grapes needed to be as clean as possible, and I truly think that if you want to make good wine, it's better to be clean. But now I know I can push it a bit further, and still keep some VA under control. So that was a good experimentation for me last year.
And Matthieu, I think that highlights a difference between your approach and how Lost Creek how Todd's approaching it too, in that you're raising that vineyard starter culture. So you're kind of selecting for a strong Saccharomyces population to kind of get it jump started. Whereas
Yes.
with Todd, we can see it takes a while for it to come up. So that might be, if you're interested in doing non-inoculated fermentations, but you do have some compromise in the grapes, then that vineyard starter culture might really help to moderate some of the risk that you're taking there.
And to be honest, I've done it in the past without doing my yeast starter, and I had way too many problems to keep doing it this way. So yeah, some people will say I'm losing some of the benefit of the other yeast population than only the Saccharomyces, and it's probably true. But for me, I had too many problems, too many batches that didn't go the way I wanted to go, that I decided to play safe now.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sort of gets back to what we started with these non-inoculated fermentations as well, is that there's not just one way to do them. There's lots of different approaches that each sort of moderates risk or takes risk a little bit more or less. And there's not one right answer, but maybe it's just an idea of saying, the more you understand about what's happening in that population, the better you can make good winemaking decisions for whether you're going to do ambient, whether you're not, whether you're going to have a vineyard starter culture, whether you're not, and how you're going to handle those things. And so I think it was fascinating for me to see the data that came out of Todd's experiment, because I think it helps to sort of think through what's really happening with Yan during the cold soak, what's really happening here and there, just as a way of just sort of deciding for yourself based on the grapes that you're getting in and what your goals are for that, what the best decision would be in your particular case. So I do want to make sure that we honor, I know that we're way over time here, so I am going to kind of wrap things up, but if you do have additional questions or comments, you can feel free to stay on after we sign off. But I do want to make sure that we thank the Virginia Wine Board for their continued funding of the Research Exchange. A big thank you to Matthieu and to Todd and Jackie for doing these experiments and sharing their wines with us. And thanks to each one of you for giving us your sensory feedback, for filling out those sensory sheets and coming and participating in discussion today. It really does make a big difference in helping people to understand, how others are perceiving the wines that they've produced as well. And do, again, keep in mind that we have got that one more sensory session in June. Keep in mind that Virginia Tech Seminar on the 20th. And be thinking about experiments for next year. If anything we've talked about today seems interesting to you, I would love to talk to you about how to do that in your own winery. So thanks everybody for being here today, and we will hopefully see you next time. So.
Good seeing everyone. Take care.